think if, Mike and I were talking last night. He was saying some different songs he was trying to decide on. I wasn't going to tell him what to sing, but it fit real well with what the message is going to be on. So usually find it's best to let the Holy Spirit talk to somebody and me not try to tell them what to do. But I think it's important for all of it, when you surrender all. One thing I appreciate what Mike and Ruthie are doing is that we've been looked at a house again last night. We've looked at houses everywhere. And each time it's not been the one for them. And they basically, each time they recognize this isn't what God has. So it's always a hard thing to do. You're driving, you dream. And so they finally found the house they like, and now they found the property. They just don't have to be in the same place. So they're still looking. But I think it's important, for all of it to look. I think, give you some questions. We're on if you remember, we've gone through, this will be the 16th one we've been on David. If you remember, we've looked at a lot of different ones. Last week we saw that, he was a man of his word. A couple weeks ago, we've seen when God says no, dark spots, the plumb line, leadership. We looked at so many different things that he's done. Let me ask you some questions. Why do so many accidents happen near home? You ever notice that? They have stuff out and talk about how many times auto accidents happen within a mile or two of your house. Now, obviously, you're traveling that road more, but they usually come to the conclusion it's complacency. You get very familiar with your surroundings and you don't pay much attention. Complacency. How many injuries and accidents happen at work on routine jobs? It's amazing how many accidents happen in just routine. When it's something really complicated, there's not many accidents because you really planned it out well, you're paying real close attention. But when you do something over and over again, you become complacent. And it happens a lot. I think it's interesting how often complacency happens in a person's life. A friend of mine, he's a believer, serves the Lord, but he's 68. He and I were talking a couple of months ago, and he said, well, I might have read one book since college. I'm thinking, in the last 50 years, you might have read one book? Basically, is that not, in a sense, complacency? I don't need anything else. I've got it. I think it's often you find that how many times when kids they leave home, and I've heard this from different people. Now that the kids are going home, I'll live however I want. I'm not accountable. They don't, they're not watching. I'm not accountable. You hear that at times. I think sometimes when you get into retirement or do anything, I've done my part. Now it's time for somebody else. I'm going to enjoy the fruits of my labor, and I'm just basically I've made it, and I'm just content to let somebody else carry the load. I think it's interesting the dangers of complacency are really, really real. And I think it's important for all of us. Paul, I think, put it best in Philippians 3. You remember in verse 13 and 14 when he makes the statement, I forget what lies behind. I haven't reached there yet, but I press on to the upward calling. When you get to 2 Timothy, the last book that he wrote, it's interesting. When you stop and think about it, he says, when you come, bring the cloak, because obviously it's very cold in the dungeons in Rome. Bring my books and parchments. Now, why, at Paul's age, and as old as he is, would he want his books and parchments? Was he complacent, or is he still studying and wanting to learn more? And you think about it, when you ask that statement, he has written Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st, 2nd Thessalonians, 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Philemon. Was he complacent? No. I think it's important to recognize he is right at the end of his life. I still want to study, because in Philippians 3, you notice he said, I consider it rubbish. I want to know more and be more like him. So let's think about the problem of complacency. It's a very real problem. In your Sunday school class, I think some of you might have been looking at Asa. If you think about an Asa, if you find it, I'll give you a couple of examples before we get to David. It's over in 2 Chronicles, and we'll also look in 2 Kings. Look over at 2 Chronicles for a moment. It talks about Asa and the king that we have. And it's interesting with Asa. 2 Chronicles chapter 14 and verse 2. Just for the background. And Asa did good and right in the sight of the Lord. He does what he should do. And then you go down a little bit further into chapter 15. And the man of God comes to him and he says to him in verse 2 of chapter 15 of 2 Chronicles, listen to me, Asa, and all Judah and Benjamin, the Lord is with you when you are with him. So if you do what I tell you to do, I'll be with you and I'll help you. And you notice then in verse 7, but you be strong, do not lose courage, for there is reward for your work. So he's telling Asa what he needs to do, and as a nation what they need to do to follow him. And they do a pretty good job. And you get to 15, they're following him, and it says, all of Judah rejoiced concerning the oath, for they had sworn with their whole heart, and sought him earnestly, and he let them find him. So the Lord gave them rest on every side. Did they do what they're supposed to do? Their leader did. They did. Rest on every side. Now Asa, as he's going along later, towards the end of his career, Israel is now causing him some problems, and so rather than turning to God, he turns to a foreign nation rather than God. And notice then what it says in chapter 16. It's interesting, starting in verse 7. Notice right in the middle it says, because you have relied on the king of Aram, which today we'd call it Syria, and have not relied on the Lord your God, therefore the army of the king of Aram has escaped out of your hand. Were not the Ethiopians and Luban an immense army with very many chariots and horsemen? Yet because you relied on the Lord, he delivered them into your hand. For the eyes of the Lord move to and fro on the earth, and he may strongly support those whose heart is completely his. Now notice then, when he was following the Lord in all of those years, God was with him. Now he tries to solve it on his own and turns to a foreign nation, and he shouldn't have. But what's interesting, look at the rest of it, notice in 10, Asa was angry with the seer and put him in prison. Well, didn't the guy not do exactly what he should have done? What Asa should have done is confess. And notice he also puts others in people in prison. And then notice what God does in 12. The 39th year of his reign, Asa became diseased in his feet. His disease was severe. Yet even in his disease, he did not seek the Lord, but physicians, and he ends up dying. So most of his life, he followed the Lord. He becomes complacent. Turns to human logic, does his things, and notice how he ends. It's interesting, go over to, since we're starting here, go back to the left a little bit, go over to 2 Kings 18. Talking about Hezekiah. Hezekiah was 25 when he becomes king. He reigned 29 years according to verse 2. And notice in verse 5 of 2 Kings 18. It says, he trusted the Lord, the God of Israel, so that after him there was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor among those who were before him. Quite a statement there. Notice 6. He clung to the Lord. He did not depart from following him, but he kept his commandments, which the Lord commanded Moses. So he does a great job of following. Remember later in the chapter, twice Sennacherib, the great general and the leader of the Syrians with his fabulous army, comes and is besieging Israel, or Judah rather, and he turns to God, and God miraculously spares him, spares Jerusalem. He's doing great, and he continues to go on. He gets sick, if you remember, in chapter 20. And in chapter 20, he gets sick, and he says he's going to die in verse 1, and he prays, and God says, all right, because you've humbled yourself and you've prayed, I'm going to give you 15 more years to live. So everything's going fine. He's walking with the Lord, he's trusting, prays for 15 more years. And then, foolishly, the Babylonians come, and he shows him, out of pride, all the wealth that he has in the temple. And look what all I've done. So then notice what happens in 16. Isaiah comes in chapter 20. Isaiah said to Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and all that is in your father's house and laid up and stored to this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. Some of your sons who shall issue from you, whom you shall beget, shall be taken away, and they shall become officials in the palace of the king of Babylon. In other words, Daniel and some of his friends, right? Notice 19, how Hezekiah responded. Hezekiah said to Isaiah, the word of the Lord which you have spoken is good. For he thought, is it not true, or so that it be peace and truth in my day? I'm old, you promised me peace, so do I really care what happens after me? Does he confess it? How many is he thinking about the people who are coming after him and his kids? He does not confess it, he doesn't say anything, and it does come to fruition. even our own country, how many times we keep kicking our debt to the corner and keep adding more and more and more, and we really don't even want to address it. Sooner or later, it will be addressed. Hezekiah did a great job, but he gets towards the end of his life, and when something happens or sin, he doesn't address it. That's fine. It won't happen in my lifetime. I really don't care. So let's go then and we go back then to chapter 11 of 2 Samuel. Let's look at David and see if he also has a problem of complacency. If you remember, starting in verse 11 and verse 1, notice it said, Then it happened in the spring, at the time when the kings go out to battle, this will be after the rainy season, that David sent Joab and his servants with him to all Israel, and they destroyed the sons of Ammon and besieged Rabbah, but David stayed at Jerusalem. You remember in the previous chapter 8, you remember he had already conquered the majority, and God gave him victory over the Moabites, the Philistines, the Ammonites, and so on. So he had greatly expanded, and basically they're going out to fight, and this is this kind of, we're so powerful and large, you really don't need me. But where should the king supposed to be? You look at almost all the time, Saul died in battle, you have all the others, Agag and all the rest of them. The kings would go out and they would lead their people. David should be leading his military and leading it, but it's kind of like, they don't really need me. I don't need to be out there. And where he should have been. Nothing would have happened later in the chapter if David had done what he should have been done. So it's interesting what you have when you look at it. I think it's interesting. Was he vulnerable? He was vulnerable, and was he accountable to anybody? He's not accountable. He didn't go do what he should have done. He sent him out. He should have gone with him. It's interesting. I think it's, what's my call? Shouldn't that be asked of all of us? How has God gifted me? And am I using it, or I've used it in the past, but doesn't mean you have to use it the same way. But if you have a gift, how long do you have the gift? Has God always gifted you, maybe in different areas? But you all of a sudden get to a certain time in your life and he's in, okay, you don't have to use it anymore. If God doesn't want you to use your gift anymore, what's he going to do? I suggest he takes you home. What is our calling? I may not be able to use it the same way I did, but I can use it in some form, and what am I doing with it? So I think it's important for us to look at it. So, am I where I should be, and am I doing what I should be doing? If I'm not, then I am asking for some discipline from the Lord. So notice the first one, he failed to fulfill his God-given calling. The second thing, if you remember, starting in verse 2 down to verse 5, he failed to address his dark spots. If you remember in 2 Samuel 5, in verse 13, I'll read it for you, or you can turn to it. You remember he has some different wives. He moves after 7.5 years. He takes over all of Israel, all 12 tribes. He moves the capital to Jerusalem. Notice what happens in 13 of chapter 5. Meanwhile, David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem after he had come from Hebron, and more sons and daughters were born to him. According to Deuteronomy, if you think about it, in chapter 17, verses 14 to 20, there's 3 things the king was not to do. He was not to store up gold, which David didn't. He wasn't supposed to rely on horses and chariots, which David didn't. But he wasn't supposed to take more than one wife, which David did. Solomon does later, even though that may be what people did in these surrounding nations. David was told what to do, and he failed to address it then. And so you think about it, this dark spot comes back to get him later in this chapter. It's interesting, he also in Deuteronomy 17, he was told to take a copy of the law, write it in his own handwriting, and look at it every day. Had he been doing that, how many times do you think he would have seen that this is what he's not supposed to do? Now you think about it, when you go back then to chapter 11, here he is, and it's evening. And so notice then what he does, starting in the failure to address dark spots, chapter 11. When evening came, David rose from his bed and walked around on the roof of the king's house. So he'd be on the second story, they'd have a balcony, and he couldn't sleep, got up to walk around. And in the homes of that day, if you think, they'd have a courtyard. So Bathsheba is in the courtyard and she is bathing. Well, notice then, normally people wouldn't see, but notice then he's up higher. It's in the evening, so she probably must have had a candlelight or had something where he could see. So notice then, it's interesting too, she was bathing, and notice the end of verse 2, it uses the word that says the woman was very beautiful in appearance. You don't find the word very mentioned that often in Scripture. If you remember with Abigail, and I remember you saw that earlier, it said she was intelligent and beautiful. Notice here it says she was very beautiful. So in other words, people use the things all the time, 1 to 10, 10 being perfect, what would she be? All right? The beauty of their day, what they considered beautiful, she was perfect. Okay, does he already have wives? Does he already have concubines? Notice every time he sees one that he wants it in the past, he would take it. So now he sees her. So that's the first problem he saw. So notice then what happens, the next thing he does. So David sent and inquired about the woman. So the second thing you notice, he inquired. Should he have been asking? No. What should he have done? He should have done what Joseph did in Genesis 39. Remember, remember with Potiphar's wife, remember she asked and he said no. And then he wouldn't listen to her when she would ask him. Then he wouldn't even be in the same room with her. And then he fled. You don't find David doing this. So he inquires, and it says, interesting, is this not Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Okay, so if you know she's married, what should David have done? He should have stopped. That's as far as it should have gone. It shouldn't have even gotten that far, but now that it has gotten that far, he should have stopped. He doesn't. He has a dark spot he's not addressing. It reminds me, I know of someone who went to the dentist several years ago, and they found out they had 6 cavities. To this day, they've never addressed them. Now, do you think those cavities are getting any bigger? Do you think that someday they may have some trouble? Do you think that might cost them a little bit more when they do have it? How many of us are not addressing issues? David didn't address it. Okay, so notice then what he does. In verse 4, he yielded then. David sent messengers, took her, and when she came to him, he lay with her, and when she had purified herself, which was required of the Old Testament law, for uncleanness, she returned to her house. The woman conceived, she sent and told David, I'm pregnant. All right, is that what was in his plan? Wasn't in either one of their plans. You go back home, I go back home, we're going to live as if nothing happened. Well, obviously something did happen. Now they're expecting. Now what are you going to do? What should you do? If you're a man after God's own heart, what should you do? You should confess it. You should acknowledge it and confess it. But he doesn't. I think it's interesting when you fail. What are my dark spots? How many of us have dark spots? I suggest every one of us has some. And what we need to do is we need to address them, because they will come back periodically. And if we don't address them, it's like with the x-rays. You have a dark spot, what happens? Your doctor wants to investigate and do something about it. We don't just ignore it, or when we do, it doesn't go away on its own. So he does it. Notice then, so he had it. He failed to do what God called him to do, and that was to lead his people. Now he failed to address dark spots that happened earlier. Remember now, you think about how old is David by this time? If he started as king when he was 30, it's going to put him at approximately what age now? Late 40s, close to 50. So think about it. He's in the middle age. Everything's going really well. The kingdom's running well. He's got good people leading everything. His leadership part that he said he was going to do in Psalms 101, he's done it. But he's failed. Notice then, the failure to confess leads to cover-up. Notice what happens then on the cover-up. In verse 6 to 13, he tries to trick Uriah. And it's interesting, I don't know if you realize it says Uriah the Hittite. But what does Uriah mean? It's 2 words put together. Anybody know what Uriah means? Yahweh is my light. I challenge you to look at Uriah, an amazing man. He might have been a Hittite, but he is worshiping the true God. And what he does here is phenomenal, what he does. But he is a very, very godly man doing what he ought to be doing. So notice then, Uriah Yahweh is my light. Notice then David, notice in verse 5, okay, since you're expecting, we're going to do something. So notice in verse 6, then David sends to Joab, and send me Uriah the Hittite. So Joab sent Uriah to David. So notice in the plan, notice in 7, then Uriah comes to David, and David's concerning how is it going with the people, how is the state, just chit-chat, not really, does he really care? Notice then he says in 8, and David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. Basically, what that's a term for their day is go home and relax, spend some time with your wife. Now his whole purpose is go home, spend time with your wife, so that when the baby is obviously coming, because you went home and spent time with your wife, everybody's going to think what? It's Uriah's son, and we have got covered it, and I won't get in trouble, and Bathsheba won't get in trouble, and everything's going to go live happily ever after. I covered my sin. Notice then what Uriah does. He leaves the king in 8. Notice in 9, Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of the Lord, and he didn't go home. Oh, the plan didn't work. He'd been out in battle, you'd think he'd go home. Notice why he doesn't go home. Notice in 10. Now when they told David, saying, Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, have you not come from a journey? Why did you not go down to your house? And Uriah said, the ark and Israel and Judah are staying in temporary shelters, and my lord Joab, the general, and the servants of my lord are camped in the open field. Shall I then go down to my house to eat and to drink and lie with my wife? By your life and the life of your soul, I will not do this thing. Where are my men? They're out in the open, they're under attack, and they're under everything else, and I'm not going to go enjoy the pleasures of home when I should be with my men and fighting with them alongside of them. And I won't do it. Well, that doesn't help David, does it? Oh, plan A didn't work. So he's going to go to plan B. And David said to Uriah, stay here today and also tomorrow, and I'll let you go home. I'll let you go back. So he stays. So notice this plan B then. Notice in 13. Now David called him, and he ate and drank before him, and he made him drunk. Why did he make him drunk? He's hoping he's going to do like Lot. He's going to go home, and then he's going to sleep with his wife, and then also, oh, it's Uriah's son or daughter or whatever it might be. So I'm going to do that. I'm trying plan B. Notice what happens at the end of 13. In the evening he went out to lie on his bed with the Lord's servants, but he did not go home. He might have been drunk, but he didn't go home. He stayed right where. And doesn't Scripture, Old Testament, talk about drinking too much? David again went against what Scripture, and he is telling it basically, Uriah, keep drinking, and you kind of follow the king's orders. He's trying to do everything he can to cover up. It's amazing how many of us try to do things to not cover up. Do I confess, or do I try to cover my sin up, make it appear like it never happened? It's amazing how many times it can have that happen. You look at different stuff, and at work, it's amazing how many vehicles are around, and they talked about, we've had 26 accidents so far this year in the refinery. But when I'm going around and I look, and I see a lot of dents on vehicles that weren't there 2 months ago, but they're not reported. Now, how in the world did those dents get on those vehicles if there wasn't an accident? Obviously, they hit something, and there's all kinds of stuff. You can easily do it, but they're covering up. Look around, nobody saw me, so I don't want to get in trouble and have to do a drug test and get written up and all the rest, so I'm just not going to tell anybody. David, obviously, plan A doesn't work. Plan B doesn't work. So now we go to plan C. Which, by the way, according to Leviticus, since he had committed adultery, what's supposed to happen to David? Supposed to kill him. Notice then what happens then. Notice you have the murder of Uriah. Notice the carrier. It came about in the morning that David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by way of the hand of Uriah. Uriah is the carrier. He's carrying what? His own death sentence. Did Uriah do what he was supposed to do? He did everything he's supposed to. Does he deliver the letter that he's supposed to deliver? Yes. Notice then the context of the letter is in 15. He had written the letter and placed Uriah in the front of the fiercest battle and withdraw from him so that he may be struck down and die. It's interesting when you get to the end of David's life, Uriah was one of his 30 mighty men. Here is one of his faithful, best soldiers. And what's he doing? So you notice Joab in 15, he watches, they're fighting against this city, and he's watching to find out where are their best men at. Their best, most valiant warriors are at this part of the city. That's where I'm going to send Uriah. And then I'm going to give the command to retreat. And if they go to retreat, Uriah is going to be set out there by himself. And what's the chances of him surviving against their best people? And notice then, David's the leader of the army, and he's telling his general what to do. If you're the general, then what are you going to do? It's also what makes it harder later when David needs to address Joab and he doesn't do it. So notice then exactly happens. They have in 17, the men of the city went out and fought against Joab, and some of the people among David's servants fell, and Uriah the Hittite also died. He did exactly what he was told to do, and he does it. So now Joab sends a report back to David. Has he been sending reports regularly back to David? No. But this is one report that David wants to hear, so he sends it back. And they send it back, and notice then they also basically use the saying, well, he got too close to the wall. They're using what happened, if you notice, during Gideon's time in Joshua. When you look at it, Joshua chapter 9, that's the statement. So the servant, the messenger, doesn't know what is taking place, but the recipient, kind of like the David and Jonathan, when they did it with the arrows. They both knew what the message meant and what was taking place, but the audience, the rest of them didn't. So notice then what happens. How do you feel right now if you're Joab? What happened to one of your best men? You just withdrew and you just got him killed. Notice what David says to him in 25. Notice how one sin leads to another when you don't address it. David said to the messenger, thus you shall say to Joab, do not let this thing displease you, for the sword devours one as well as another. Hey, it's all part of fighting, it's part of battle. You'll lose good and you'll lose bad. Pretty callous from what David normally is like, isn't it? Amazing what happens when we have sin in our life and it just keeps building and it's building. You never intended it for her to become pregnant. You never intended this. Now you didn't intend murder, and you got Joab involved. More and more people are involved. Notice what happens then if you go on. This battle is great. Notice then in 26, now the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead. She mourned for her husband. So how long did she mourn? According to Genesis and Joshua, that'd be 7 days. So she's expecting, so then she's probably been expecting for roughly how long? A month? So now, obviously, we want to move him into the house till he becomes David's wife, or else you don't wait 9 months or however long, because what will happen? How is she expecting when Uriah hadn't been here? So then notice then they move her into the house, along with all these other wives. And David thinks what? I've got it all covered. Nobody's going to know. It'll be my son, my daughter, and nobody will know the difference. I've covered. How many times have we tried to do that? I was thinking about some of the applications, because next week we'll see some others. Others may not see my cover up, but God does he not? It's amazing how many of the different things that happen that way. Am I a soldier of Jesus Christ? Am I active or inactive? I think a lot of us, we recognize we've been in the service, but how many of us are inactive? As a soldier, am I following Uriah's example or David's example? Uriah, did he do exactly what a soldier should do? Did David do what he should have done as a soldier? He had been doing it for years, but a dark spot came up, and he didn't address it, he didn't leave, and he surrendered to it. What's my calling? Am I where I should be and doing what I should be doing? I think it's amazing. Gene and I have known so many of our friends who serve the Lord but are no longer doing it. It's amazing who have got complacent and are not doing anything for the Lord today. How many of us confess and how many of us are covering up? It's best just to Confess it and move on. If David had done that, what might have changed? Because from this point on, the rest of his life is nothing but problems. He was a man of God. He will confess it next week. But notice he has problems. And his family has problems. Why did he not address it? Because he thought, what? I've covered it up. Nobody knows. Everything's going to be fine. So think about it this week. How many of us have ever thought, Lord, I don't know what my dark spots are. Does God know? How many of us have ever said, Lord, show me my dark spots? And by the way, do you think any of your friends or family could show you some of your dark spots? They could, but how many of us are willing to listen? I think what happens, most of us get really upset or we don't want to listen, and therefore people don't tell them. If we really want to know, ask the Lord and then ask others who will truly be honest with us. Then we can address them before they become major, like what happened today.